Hello everybody. What you're looking at is my old distributor off my Ford tractor. See it there real good. Had a person ask me, and I apologize for the video where I talk about the mechanical advance of my distributor. The wind was just right to get into the mic and kind of fouled that part of it up, and I apologize for that, but best I could do for that day. But I replaced the distributor on my tractor when I redid the head and everything. Just where these screws mount the plate, threads were shot. It's probably the original off the tractor, I don't know. It's awful old, put it that way. And it was time for a new one. So rather than put a bunch of new parts into this old one, I just got a new one. And they come with all the parts. A rebuilt comes with all the parts. A brand new one comes with all the parts. But the fellow was asking me how much of a challenge this is to do, because he thought he had the same problem that I had, which was it missed at high RPMs because the timing wasn't advancing right. And you know, I'm not a mechanical genius. I've worked on tractors and cars and trucks over the years. They're not that hard to do if you're willing to learn and you got a good instruction book to reference. YouTube has some great videos out there. In fact, some people talk about these old 8-ins on up, about working on the distributors and Jubilees and everything. And a lot with my tractor, a Jubilee is about the same thing, but the few things are different. And one is the timing. At idle, I'm supposed to be at 4 degrees advanced. I think a Jubilee is supposed to be at 8 degrees or 6 degrees. I can't remember. So a few things are different, but it's, you know, bearable. But I told him I would try to explain, and I'd use very simple terms and try to put in everything else that everyone else kind of does not put in. They tend to leave things out and not explain, you know, assume you know certain things. But distributor, when it's out, looks like this. There's a gasket here that keeps the oil from coming up out of the crankcase and leaking out, and that has to be in good shape for your new one. Make sure it's on there. You have this gear that is slanted. It meshes with the camshaft, and when you push it in, when it starts in the bottom, it's going to turn as it does, and it'll turn your rotor or your shaft just a tad bit, about 10 degrees. Now on the bottom there is this hexagonal cavity, and I've got an Allen wrench here. That's what I'm using as a reference. The shaft on the oil pump looks exactly like this, same shape, and in fact it's the same size. This fits right in there. But 9 times out of 10, when you pull your old distributor out, the shaft in the oil pump will come out with it. It's no big deal. It's not the end of the world. It's just because it gets in there, it kind of gets wiggled in there, and it's tight. It sits very loosely in the oil pump usually, and so the least resistance is to come out of the oil pump, and it comes out with the distributor. And it's about, oh, so long, maybe a little longer. It's straight, but it probably will come out with it. And you have to have this back in the oil pump properly to get your new distributor to fit back in. No big deal. I'm going to set this down for a minute. You take the shaft out, clean it up. You can see the hole it goes down through, and you got to be kind of careful because there is the top of that hole in the crank side of the block is open down into the crankshaft and the oil pan. the bottom is solid, and there's a hole there that this fits down through to help guide it and hold it in place, and it's what the oil pump bolts to. If you get this, drop it, and for some reason it falls through the top part, you're going to be taking the pan off and trying to fish this out. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But what I used was just, you can use a socket with an extension on it. I had this little, it's like for working on appliances, taking machine screws out. I believe it's a 1/4 or 5/16, I don't remember. It fits right in there. And you put the shaft back down in there, you put this on the end of the shaft, and you just twist it, work it. It'll pop down into the place where it belongs. And I went ahead and turned the oil pump just to make sure everything was like it should be. And then I removed it. You want to make sure it's centered as well in that hole as you can get it, because it has to, like I say, fit into the bottom of your distributor. And the more centered it is, the less wiggling you got to do, and the less probably aggravation you'll have, because it's a tight fit. I mean, it has to be lined up in the center, because there's no slop in this for it to move. And once you get that down in there, you're probably going to have to turn your crankcase just a little bit, because that'll turn your crank a camshaft, which will turn this shaft, which will finally line this up and it'll let it fall down on there. It's not that big a deal, okay? I'm also going to show, while I'm over here where there's more light, the points on this, how they open. I can't tell if I'm getting in there where you can see. They open and they close. Probably not, but they open and they close. Tiny little points. Okay, that's something I'm going to show you now, because I'll be referring to that later on. But let me take you back over here to the tractor, and we'll do a little more talking. Shadows aren't too bad, so I guess we can do it here. There's enough light. One thing to remember about these tractors, and it's true with most American engines, when you're standing at the front and where the water pump and everything else, the front of the crankcase is, that is the front of the engine. When you're facing it like so, it turns clockwise. Now when you're looking down at the rotor on the distributor, which is attached to the camshaft, it turns clockwise. If you were looking at the PTO in the back, if it was engaged and the engine was running, it would turn clockwise. And it's not life or death stuff, it's just the kind of thing. I really don't like to turn the engine the wrong way, even if I don't have the head on it or anything like that too much. It's meant to turn one way, and I figure, they did that for a reason. Over in Europe, I guess a lot of them go the opposite way. I know, at least on airplane motors and stuff. But the firing order on this is 1, 2, 4, 3. It's 1, 2, 4, 3. Okay. Something else I want to talk to you about. If you're 180 degrees off, the firing order is 4, 3, 1, 2. Okay, 4, 3, 1, 2. 1 and 4 are in unison. 2 and 3 are in unison, the pistons. That means they're at the same height. When 1 and 4 are at the top, for top dead center, 2 and 3 are at the bottom. And the strokes of the engine, like when the number 1's at top dead center and the spark plug's ready to fire, is the first stroke is the power stroke. It's been ignited, it's forcing the piston down. Right as it gets to the bottom, the exhaust valve will open, and as it comes up, it pushes the exhaust out. That's the exhaust stroke. Right near the top, the exhaust valve closes, intake valve opens, and as it goes down the second time, it's drawing in the fuel from intake, air and the gas. As it nears the bottom, intake valve closes. Okay, now both valves will stay closed. The piston will come back up. It takes that air and fuel and compresses it. And as it gets near the top, the coil will send a spark, and it'll go through the rotor over to the plug. I mean, it happens faster than you can blink your eye. The plug will make a spark, and that ignites the mixture, and then it repeats. The force pushes the power stroke down. Those are the 4 strokes, and remember, 1 and 4 are in unison. Now on your flywheel, there is an inspection plate here. There are different places on different engines. On the Ford, it's right here. You loosen this up, you slide that over. You can, when these are up at the top as high as they can go, you should be at 0 on your markings on the flywheel. Mine go from 30 degrees to 0. Now I don't want to set mine at 0 because at idle it's supposed to be at 4 degrees advanced. Okay? At full throttle it's supposed to be 24 degrees advanced. So you need to remember that also. I took white, but I used the number the plug wires with, the white paint, and marked 24 and 4 both. And this for you, it makes it easier to see when you're with your timing light. Okay, now I'm going to squat down here. But have all that explained so far. Now I'm going to explain the electrical here to the distributor best I can. Mine is a negative ground tractor. I mean the negative post of the battery is ground to the engine. There really is no frame to this tractor. I mean, the front end bolts to the front of the block, transmission bolts to the back of the block, and the hydraulic system bolts to that, and so on. There really is no frame to this, so it just bolts to the engine, basically. Now the positive side you probably can't see very well, but it feeds over to the key. You turn the key to the on position, power comes from the key, and I've got a yellow wire here. It comes over to the coil, and since this is negative ground, positive feed, the coil has a positive side and a negative side. I go into the positive side. It goes out the negative side. Now something to remember too, I have a 12 volt system on my tractor. The points, which I'll show you right here, cannot handle over 6 volt. So you have to reduce that from 12 volts to 6 volt. And since I have a 12 volt, mine has a resistor built into it. If I did not have that resistor built into it, when it came out the negative side, I'd have to have a resistor bar up here. It would go up to that, go through the bar, it'd be reduced to 6 volt, there'd be a wire from there down to here. But between here and here, I could have a 6 volt coil and be fine, but I'd have to have the resistor bar over here. And if I just had a 6 volt battery, I wouldn't even need that. Just a 6 volt coil, 6 volt points, and that's how it's set up. But you do have to reduce that down to 6 volt. If you don't, you'll burn your points up real fast because they're not designed to handle that much electricity. Okay, but this attaches to here, which feeds up a copper strip to here, which feeds into this side of the points, and the points are connected at the tip right there by my fingernail. And this round thing that's kind of round on the corner and flat on the sides, it's kind of like a square but rounded off on the corners, it turns. And as it gets to the corners, it pushes the points apart. Okay? Now when it does that, it breaks the contact. But the contact goes through the condenser, goes into the distributor. Distributor is attached to the block, and that goes through the ground back to the battery. And that's your loop. Okay? So really it is just an electrical circuit is what it is. Now your coil, I'm going to use a reference of a gun, and I hope that don't offend anybody, but it's like an old West gun. You cock the trigger, the magazine turns, and your bullet goes into the chamber, and pow, one shot. It doesn't send a continual stream of bullets, it's just one shot, okay? When the juice is coming down to here and not flowing, this just sits idle. But it only, does it for just so long. As this shaft in here is turning, it's continually going off, recharging, going off, recharging, going off, recharging. But when the juice is going through this, it's like cocking the gun and the bullet coming into the chamber. When this shaft turns and that opens the points and breaks that connection, the gun goes off. Spark comes out the top, goes over to the top of the rotor. The rotor should be pointed at one of these connections here. Doesn't matter whichever cylinder is coming at top dead center. I mean, faster than you can blink an eye, bang, plug fires, and you get your firing. That's how it works, and it's off, on, cock, fire, cock, fire. And that's the best way I can explain the coil. Now, as far as the mechanical advance, as those wings, as you rev the tractor up, the shaft turns faster, and that causes those wings to want to expand because there's the outer shaft is rubbing against the inner shaft, and it works it outward. Well, that moves your timing. Your timing will go from 4 degrees to 10 degrees to 12. It just depends on where your throttle's set at. And that helps. As the engine's running faster, the spark needs to get there just a tad bit sooner to keep firing up near the same place on the top. And that's why it does it. It increases keeps your power consistent. Otherwise, your spark would be happening on the downward side, and you lose power that way. That's really what the mechanical advance does. Now, a lot of later models use vacuum out of the intake. As the vacuum increased, it changed the timing. Then it went into modules and computers, monitoring the engine, changed the timing. And nowadays you don't even have distributors on cars. They haven't for a long time. They go to coil packs, and sensors tell the computer where the crankshaft is and when they need a spark to what cylinder, and it's all done by that. But as far as changing the distributor, if you're just putting a new one in and your old one's working fine, or reasonably well, put it that way, the easiest way to keep your references and not to have a trouble at the start is this oil port here. Make a mark on your block in reference to it, because your new one will have the same thing, and you just put it in the same spot. Now take your cap off, look at your rotor, see where it's pointed at, which cylinder is next to fire, or maybe it's pointing right at this hole here, or pointing up at number 3, whatever it's doing, and take reference of that, because that's important to keep the new one in as close to that as you can get it. That's one way. The other way is when you take your distributor out, you can put number 1 at top dead center. And you do that, you take your plug out, you turn your engine over either by hand or have somebody on the starter. But as it comes up on the compression stroke, it'll actually want to push your thumb away from the hole. There's compression in it. It's like an air compressor leaking. It wants to push out. Well, by that time, you'll see your degrees coming up on your flywheel. And you just want to bring it on up until 4. If you have that pressure and you're at number 4, you're at top dead center on number 1. Okay? But anyway, if for any reason you're at 4, either number 1's at top dead center or number 4 is. And that's something to keep in mind because they're in unison, okay? It takes 2 complete revolutions for this cylinder to go from top dead center back to top dead center, because you have power stroke, it's down, exhaust is up, back down for intake, and back up for compression. 2 strokes. Okay, you reference that, or you set it on top dead center, whatever you've done. You take your new one, you put it in there, you try to line everything up the best you can. You go down, and as it meshes into the gear, expect your rotor to move about 10 degrees to the right, clockwise. So you may want to set it just slightly off before you're marked before you put it in there, because it will move slightly when the gears engage on the camshaft. And unless you're extremely lucky, you'll get down to where it's about 1/8 of an inch from the block, and it'll bottom out. It's sitting on top of the hex key, as I showed you earlier, the oil shaft. And what you just have to do is what I did, was hold it with one hand, and with your other hand move the crankshaft, and that'll turn the camshaft, which will turn the distributor shaft just a little bit until that lines up with this and slides in. Then it'll slide the rest of the way down. You can put your pieces on either side, and you want to just finger tight them. Now the next thing you need to do, and it's very important you remember this, sometimes you may move this quite a bit to get that to happen, what I just explained, back and forth and back and forth. You want to make sure if you're not too far from top dead center, you bring this back to 4 degrees. Okay, if you just say I'll just spin it around to the 1 revolution to this, well, 4 is going to be at top dead center, not 1. And if you've got it set up that way and you think number 1's going to fire, it's going to actually be number 4, and she's not going to want to run. In fact, it happens quite often, even to the experienced people, and I don't claim to be experienced, but it happens. You just forget for a second. That's all it takes. But once you got your distributor in there, you can take your plug out, put your plug wire on it, pull it up against the engine so it's grounded. You can turn your key on then, hold your plug against your thing, turn this ever so slightly until you see a spark. And you don't want to be hanging onto the wire either. Best thing is to lean it up there and watch it. You'll see the little spark. The other thing you'll hear too is like the thermostat in your house. When you're heating your house, right before the furnace comes on, you hear the thermostat will make a little dink or click sound. It makes the same noise when the points open up and the coil's going off. And that's how I set mine. I just listened, and it gets you in the ballpark, gets you to where the engine will start. But you tighten that down once you're that far. Get your firing order on your distributor cap and your plugs. Go around there and crank her and see what happens. Usually it'll start. If you're fairly close. Then if you have your timing light, you set it up on number 1, because these degrees are supposed to be on number 1. And then you let your engine run and look at your mark by your timing light. And you may have to just move this a little bit left or right to get it back to 4, and then tighten them down good. Rev your engine up and watch with your timing light, and as you get near full throttle, it should be up around 22, 24, and that's how that works. If that's the case, your mechanical advance is working right. Now my new one, when I got it, I had to take it apart because the mechanical advance wasn't lubed and it was just stuck. So I lubed it a bit and worked it back and forth for about 15 minutes and kind of freed it up a little bit. It would not have worked at all the way it was, and I would not have been too doggone happy, but you know, that's the way it happens. I think maybe a remanufactured one probably would be lubed up, but I wouldn't take it for granted. But you also need to set the gap on your points. You take a feeler gauge, and I believe mine were 25, and you just as you're at the corner of this right here, that should be at 25 degrees, and it should just be a little bit of friction as you run it in and out. Not a lot of drag, but it's fairly simple to do. Like I said, the hardest part about swapping it is getting it over the oil shaft and going down in there, but it is not impossible to do. It takes a little patience. If for some reason you don't set your degrees and you're not getting it to fire, the first thing I would do as far as troubleshooting is perhaps you had your top dead centers wrong. And if that was the case, I would take this off number 1. Well, I'd take these other 3 off, but put number 1 here on 4, 2, 4, and 3. Then go around and crank it over, and you might surprise yourself and she fires. But you know what? It will. It's not the end of the world if it is that way. It will run that way. And you know, you got her going anyhow. You know, that's the important thing. Hopefully it will work out for you. They're not complicated to work on. It takes a little fine tuning with carburetors and distributors and timing. But you know, you find little things here and there. But just kind of make sure you take mental note of everything. Oh, the one thing I wanted to say too, because the older tractors, some of them are positive ground instead of negative ground, and you may run into that fact. If it is positive ground, it's no big deal. Your feed will go from the negative to the battery, then down to here. The difference being, you'll have to turn your coil around. You'll have to feed in the negative and come out the positive. And then if it needs to go to the resistor bar, fine, or just down to the distributor, fine. That's something to keep in mind, because it will not work if you're positive ground and you run this down to the positive. The coil won't work. It's like trying to run the gun backwards. It won't work. It has to feed in the same side as the battery post it comes from. That's something to remember, because there is a positive and a negative. If you're coming off the positive, it has to feed in the positive. If you're feeding off the negative, it has to feed in the negative and leave the positive. But that's just, let me double check and make sure I haven't forgotten anything. That really is just about it for this time. If I should think of anything else, if you have any questions, like I said, this is not a how-to. This is just a walkthrough of it, and I tried to be as simple as I could be about it. This is how I did it, and hey, she runs a lot better. And I'm glad I did end up getting a new one, because like I said, it's just less hassle having to check that the screws hadn't wiggled loose or stuff like that. But I'll let you fellas go. Hope everyone has a good day. Take care.